Today, I'm going to be talking about a brief history of Brazilian music. Of course, it is absolutely impossible to tell all the history of Brazil in 45 minutes. It's actually bizarre. However, my goal, what I was thinking is the following. What what should you know in order not to embarrass yourself in a conversation? You know, I was remembering, like, what if I was to study the music of a different country, you know, the music of Egypt? What do I need to know in order to like feel like, ah, okay, I know what we're talking about. So I built this course thinking about this. And at the same time that I'll be presenting some pretty basic information that maybe if you know already some things about Brazilian music, it may feel a little boring. On the other hand, I'm going to try to tell the story through the lenses of the people, which is something that is not very common, especially when we're talking about countries that are outside of the European and the United States realm. So the way I'm gonna tell you the information is through the eyes of the people who created that music, and not through the eyes of someone who's just observing from far away. Okay, so by doing this, I hope that you can create a picture of Brazilian music that is more real. And many times in the Brazilian literature, there's a lot of this vibe of like Brazil is this joyful carnival that is so amazing and beautiful, and everybody's happy and everybody hugs each other and it's so amazing and there's a big community. And this is actually a lie. You know, there's constant class struggle, there is constant racism, there's constant problems between society and government, or corruption, and a lot of stains that keep affecting the way culture is produced here. So at the same time that you have a lot of this tension, you also have always beautiful and creative solutions that artists manage to find in order to create community, in order to create art, and in order to express the experience they were feeling. So instead of just giving you a chronological order of everything, I decided to divide this class into 5 spaces. It's basically chronological, but instead of thinking about a period of time, I decided to think about a space. So I'm going to share my screen for a second and tell you just briefly, show you the order of things that I'm going to be doing. So basically, I decided to divide in these 5 spaces, and this is what we're going to do today. We're going to study the slave ships as a metaphor for the music that was being created in the beginning of the history of Brazil. The ships, the boats that were bringing prisoners from West Africa to Brazil. Then we're going to study the cabarets. It's a completely different era, and the cabaret can signify a lot of that feeling that you could see on the cities. Then we're going to study the space called the Carnaval as a space, as a social space, as a way of breaking rules, the carnavalization of society, which means for a second, there's no more class, everybody's equal. Then we're going to study the Copacabana Palace, which is the name of the big hotel in the Copacabana beach. This is around the time of the Bossa Nova. And then to end, we're going to study the universities as an academic space where people had the chance to start thinking about how their music could be an instrument of social protest and other types of, I don't know, demands or a different type of expression regarding the political climate at the time. So and then for each one of those 5 spaces that I'll be talking about, I will be playing some examples. So I already sent you the link on the chat if you want to access this page, but I would recommend that you can check this out later. At the end here, there's an open Spotify playlist with like the essential Brazilian albums that everybody should know. So, you know, if you wanna understand Brazilian music, there are 15 artists that you must know, and I put all of their albums, my favorite ones at least, on this Spotify playlist. And the full album. So if you're a little tired of one artist, you can jump to the next one. That's perfectly fine. And then I have a little suggested bibliography here. I didn't work too hard on the bibliography. I copied from a paper I wrote some time ago. But still, every book that you see here is, or every article that you see here is extremely interesting if you want to, I don't know, explore a little more all this specifics of the time periods that I'm going to talk. So back to me. So let's start. Here we go. We will, first and most important thing, let's enter this old area of Brazilian music, the beginning of Brazil. Brazil started in the year 1500. Well, that's how the Europeans normally talk about this. Brazil existed forever, and it had a huge native Brazilian population that was basically all killed by the Portuguese colonizers. And the Portuguese, and so the question is, why do we normally study Brazilian music starting from the 1850s and not from before? One of the biggest reasons is that there's not enough documentation about what music was played before. And especially the Portuguese as colonizers were very incompetent in documenting culture. There was never a project for Portuguese people to arrive to Brazil and say, oh, let's write down their music, let's study their language, let's study their biology. It's completely like there was no interest. Portugal arrived to Brazil with one goal: make new slaves, Christianize every person that wasn't Christian, bring all the money back to Portugal, all the gold and all the wealth that they could find. And so musically speaking, we don't have any documentation from that time. Very few things survived. All that we know about the music from that time was always from German travelers, English travelers, French travelers. If you see paintings of Brazil, like from the 1600s, from the 1500s, there were always paintings by French, by English, by Americans, or by Germans, never by Portuguese, also never by Spanish. So Portugal and Spain were very different than other countries when they were colonizing. Second thing that we need to remember, in the case of Portugal colonizing Brazil, there was never a project for colonization, of urbanization, of creating a city in Brazil. It was all about extracting wealth and bringing it back. So only Portuguese men came to Brazil in the beginning. So there were no families or anything. A bunch of men, normally the low class of Portugal, would come to Brazil because it was very dangerous. And then they would just basically be alone, a bunch of men alone. And there was a lot of rape going on with natives. It was a shit show, honestly. And so this story, we need to understand that it's a bloodbath. One of the biggest genocides in the world was the genocide of Native Americans in Latin America by the colonizers. It was just mass murdering after mass murdering. And so we have to have this perspective. The other perspective that's also extremely important is to remember that Brazil has in its history the largest concentration of slaves in the history of the planet. So never in the history of this planet you had so many enslaved people as in Brazil. You know, Brazil, just as a comparison, in the United States, they say that about 500,000 people were enslaved. In Brazil, they say it's around almost 6 million slaves. So this has a completely big effect in the way culture was created. So Brazil is way more African than we think. And it's important always to bring this perspective back to the discussion. So you know, I like to have this critical look over the situation and at the same time understand what inheritance do we have from that time and what does that represent. So when we talk about music that is really old from the times of the colony, we always need to remember that there is a huge influence from the Portuguese music that was normally more lyrical, played with the guitar. And then there's the African side that is normally all about collectivity, community, drumming together, singing, question and answer. So you have an individualistic type of music, the Portuguese one, and then you have a collective type of music. That's the African inheritance. And you know, in this world of the beautiful Brazilian miscegenation, or like all this interaction, you always see these two currents kind of joining together. It's not a peaceful encounter. It is an actually pretty aggressive type of encounter. And and then, so many times we fall into this wrong assumption that, oh, this music represents the peace between, you know, the African inheritance and the European inheritance. No, it's not peaceful. It's very turbulent. And so it's important that we always bring this awareness to the music. So let me play you just an example of a type of song that would be heavily Portuguese influenced, okay? This is called Modinha. This is one of the first type of music that we will hear at the time. And you see how lyrical it is with a guitar accompaniment and almost like a bel canto, like an operatic type of singing.
Quem me ver aflito e triste, no mais oculto retiro. Quem me ver aflito e triste, no mais oculto retiro.
So you see how sad it is, how this is typical Portuguese music. Some say that there was a big influence of the Moor population, the North African Arab population that used to live in Portugal, that actually conquered Portugal for 1,000 years. And so there was a huge Arabic influence to the singing, to the lyricism, to this idea of lamentation. It's almost religious the way the voice works in this lyrical type of singing. So on one hand, you have this type of music that was very popular in Brazil and people would sing it a lot. On the other side, you had the music that was 100% coming from Africa. And when we talk about Africa, we need to remember there were two parts in Africa where people were arrested and brought to Brazil. One is in the West African coast, where now you have Nigeria and Benin. This is called the Dahomey Empire, or the Yoruba people. And then you have south in Angola and Congo, where now it's the Congo and Angola, where it's a different type of ethnicity, so a different type of music. What I'm gonna play now is just one example of West African music from Candomblé. That's the local religion of the Yoruba people. And I have many recordings of this. If you want, I can recommend you some. But listen how it's completely different, how there's question and answer, how there's a lot of rhythm, and it's a completely different sonority.
Oximo kumbo sarame sandangue. Ai 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 ai. Oximo kumbo sarame sandangue. Ai 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 ai. Oximo kumbo sarame sandangue. Ai 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 ai. Oximo kumbo sarame sandangue.
So it's almost like a ritual. In many of these West African cultures, there's no difference between a musical performance and an actual ritual, a religious ritual. It's kind of the same. The word music for many of those people also represents dance, also represents praying. It represents everything. So it's a whole different concept. So this music was also happening all the time in Brazil. And in the beginning, here's the interesting that will lead us to our second social space, the cabarets, okay? I'm fast forwarding 200 years now. In Brazil, because the cities were so poor and not well equipped, there was no infrastructure in any cities. There was no theaters, no cinema, no libraries, no gardens, nothing. You know, everything was just big farms with hundreds and hundreds of thousands of enslaved people. And so basically there was no entertainment for the upper class. It was really rare for someone to listen to music. So all the upper class used to go to the slave house where the slaves would live to check out that music. So at the same time that they would think that music was horrible, oh my God, it's out of tune, it's a bunch of rhythm, and anything that has too much rhythm is associated with the body, it's obscene. You know, it's not, our religion doesn't allow this type of obscene type of dancing. But at the same time, because of the lack of entertainment, a lot of the elite would go and check out that music. So at the end, everybody kind of liked this type of dance. And little by little, especially after as we approach the abolition of slavery. So if I'm not wrong, Brazil was the last country in the American continent to abolish slavery. Not the last country in the world, because some countries in Africa still had slavery until, 50 years ago. But Brazil in the American continent was the absolutely last. The reason being that Portugal the most important financial activity of Portugal was slave trade. This is how they made their money. So for them to end slave trade and end slavery meant the collapse of economy. So, and that was a moral dilemma for local people at the time, for the elite, you know, how can we suddenly, you know, harm our economy? We need to continue our slave trade. This is super important. And then England decided to interfere. There was a whole mess. And finally, in 1888, we had our abolition of slavery. And the abolition is important because suddenly you had millions and millions of enslaved people who were free. And the government never offered a way for people to reintegrate to society, never offered them a job. Here, now that you're not anymore a slave, here's a job for you. No, basically millions and millions of people were just thrown out of the places where they used to live with no job, with no house, with no health, absolutely nothing. So the majority of recently freed slaves came to the big cities. When they come to the big cities, you start to have the connection between European music, between the lyrical, very delicate and individualistic type of music with a lot of that African rhythm. And roughly, I could say that this is kind of how Choro started. And this is the next style that we'll study, Choro, C-H-O-R-O. That's the first urban instrumental music in Brazil. And it's still played nowadays. It's one of the most delicate and beautiful types of music that mixes European dances, such as the polkas, the mazurkas, the Scottish, all this type of European ballroom dances that the nobles were like using fancy dresses and dancing in Paris. And a lot of the urban class, you know, more of the working class in the cities in Brazil, especially in Rio de Janeiro, were listening to those dances and they started to play on their instruments, but with a little bit of a different groove, with a little bit of syncopation, of a different approach to how to create variations in the melody. And so this is kind of how Choro emerged. I can play a little quick Choro here that I love, very famous, many of you may know. That's a typical Choro. So you can hear like how the melodies are very European, very detailed, flamboyant, romantic melodies. It sounds like Chopin, you know, to this like super detailed and ornamented melodies. And at the same time, you have a rhythm that's full of syncopation, a rhythm that's like, that has a forward drive, you know, when you can see that the musicians are having fun. There's improvisation at the same time. Improvisation in this way, it's an African invention. You know, music that is collective, like the West African music, is a music that allows people to be way more creative because they're just keeping a cycle, a rhythmic cycle, and then it's okay to improvise. It's okay to change things. So this is, I think a lot of this joy that we feel in this music is inherited from the West African models that we had here, not here in New York, there in Brazil. So when we talk about Choro, it's very important to remember, like there are four figures that I wrote down on that handout on my Google Docs. One is Ernesto Nazaré. Ernesto Nazaré is an incredible early Choro composer. You'll see his name on the Google Drive. And he wanted to be a classical pianist. He studied a lot of Chopin, and he used to play the piano. The piano is an instrument that is really key here because piano was an instrument of the elite. And then composers started playing popular music on the piano. And that was a huge transformation in the way music was perceived. Suddenly an instrument that was European, coming straight from the factory in Paris, was playing music with African rhythms. Oh my God, you know. So there were a lot of huge polemic incidents going on at the time when people from the elite would suddenly play a piece that was not very well seen by the high society. And this is a problem that we see all the time in Brazil. Rich people hate music of the poor people. It is true. It happens all the time. You see in books, in diaries, in articles, people saying like, the music of this, black people, this is ridiculous, this is horrible, this is obscene. We want the European model. You had all these elite people in Brazil at 100 degrees summer wearing French dresses, because to be French was to be noble and not to play the music of the poor. However, about the same time, a lot of the Brazilian dances and music that were like popular styles started to become really famous in Paris, in Russia, in Germany, in England, in the United States. People from all over the world started to hear that great groovy type of melodies, and that music started to become really famous outside. And this is something that happens in many styles all over the world. First, a popular music is rejected by the elite, and then this popular music that was rejected becomes really famous all over the world. Everybody loves it. And then the elite on the country decides to, oh, no, actually we love it too. So this is a interesting sociological thing that happens. It happened with rock and roll. It happened with hip hop here in the United States. It happened with jazz. Jazz in the beginning was rejected by the upper classes. It took time until jazz was famous in many other places for the local upper class here to accept that music. So little by little, you started to have this Choro music becoming more and more popular. And the other names that are very important that I would mention is Pixinguinha, who is considered the father of Choro, the most prolific composer. And Pixinguinha, and it's so hard to spell his name that he's even my Wi-Fi password, his name. So, but Pixinguinha, you'll see on the playlist some of his compositions, was a brilliant composer, brilliant improviser, and his melodies are just gorgeous. And he is just a very beloved figure in Brazil, and is considered to be one of the fathers of our music. If I had to choose like 3 composers to personify Brazil, I would choose Pixinguinha as the first one. Okay, Ernesto Nazaré was more of the classical, brought more of the classical component. Pixinguinha was kind of the climax, the ultimate, the most perfect composer. I also mentioned Chiquinha Gonzaga, the first very well-known Brazilian female composer, who was very important in managing to bring music from the poor classes, popular music, to the upper classes. So she was in the middle, and she had to sacrifice a lot about her social status, because she was hanging out with, with a lot of people who were from the lower class at her time, and she was really not seen well by society. They thought she was a prostitute, or they would criticize her behavior a lot. So she was an actual very powerful feminist in the history of Brazil. I recommend checking her out. You'll see her name later on the handout. And then with Brazilian music kind of evolving on this direction of integration, and little by little, the elite started to see like, oh my God, this popular music that we hated, that we didn't like, that we thought was obscene, is becoming really popular all over the place. So let's start to call it our national music. Let's appropriate that for us and say like, no, this is not anymore the music from the poor. This is our music. This is our Brazilian exotic tropical beauty, And this is during the 30s, what I wrote in the Carnaval. The Carnaval represents the abolition of social class. In all parts of the world, whenever you have Carnaval, it means that, people wear a mask and you don't know anymore who the person is. So Carnaval, there's a way, a very beautiful, heroic way of seeing Carnaval as, identities don't matter anymore. Everybody has a mask. So it was an opportunity for whoever is rich to wear a mask and go hang out with the poor, or from whoever is poor to wear a mask and go hang out on the street with the rich. So it's a of course, there are many problems of Carnival. The government was forbidding African Brazilians to play drums on the street, and the police then was beating up people and forbidding certain types of musical performances. But at the end, there was just so much music being played that the government had to accept. And instead of like trying to refuse, decided to accept that as national identity. So when we entered the 30s is when the big samba was created. So samba is basically, comes a little bit from the Choro tradition, the way the rhythms were created, the way the melodies were ornamented, but this time there are lyrics. Choro is mostly instrumental. Samba is always sung, and the melodies are slow, very syncopated, but still very slow. And it's something that everybody can sing together, almost as a choir singing together. So it's very celebratory. So at that time, you know, Brazil had a very populist type of government that decided to transform samba in this big thing. This is when you had that Disney cartoon called Saludos Amigos. The name is in Spanish and it's about Brazil, by the way. Okay, Saludos Amigos, where they play Aquarela do Brasil, the watercolor of Brazil. I wanted to show a brief snippet of music from this time. This is also when you have Carmen Miranda, the lady with the tutti frutti hat, okay, singing, and everybody loved that was Brazilian samba, the national style of Brazil. And they started to sell this all over the world, you know, as almost as a marketing campaign. This is our music. So I just wanted to show you a brief snippet of Carmen Miranda's, a movie that she participated here in the United States, in Hollywood. But that's kind of the vision that Brazil was exporting to the world. And you may say that is good. I think it's absolutely horrific. I need to find my page, sorry. Here. Just give me a second. So this is the lady with the tutti frutti hat. And I just wanted to notice like the symbols that they're putting on the screen, you know, like bananas, monkeys, slaves, and all of that.
Everybody look at me and then begin to talk about the Christmas tree.
Okay, I'll stop it here. It's pretty bizarre, right? Just another quick example. That's the Aquarela do Brasil. That's the Disney movie from 1942, and you may have.
É o Brasil brasileiro, é o mulato insoneiro, vou cantar-te nos meus versos. O Brasil samba que dá bamboleio, que faz gingar. O Brasil do meu amor, terra de Nosso Senhor. Brasil, Brasil, pra mim, pra mim.
Okay, I'll stop here. You can listen to this later. I don't want to take your time. So that's kind of like this idea of like Brazil is this beautiful nature and everybody's here together, you know, and it's selling a lot. It's a marketing campaign, you know, and yeah, Joe, it's correct. You know, there's a lot of this idea of like slow vocals and fast rhythm. That's basically a characteristic of samba. It's slow melodies because it allows a lot of people to sing together. Everything that's slow is easier to sing in a group. You know, everything that's too fast is more individualistic. So just as a general idea. So, you know, we went through this phase of like big bands playing music and everything, and big casinos with samba artists introducing their music, and you had great names. I listed on my Google Doc a lot of other samba artists that are more recent. So they're not necessarily from the 30s and 40s. However, and they became kind of the big samba composers in our history. So you should check them out anyways. And the music is absolutely incredible. Then we went, then we start moving to our next stage, which is the Copacabana Palace, the big hotel in the Copacabana beach. And that's the beginning of Bossa Nova. There is a reason why everybody knows Bossa Nova. There's a reason why every person who I'm asked, what Brazilian music song do you know? I like, olha que coisa mais linda. The Girl from Ipanema, The reason being that Jobim was the first big Brazilian composer who had lyrics written in English. That's the number one reason. There's a lot of his songs were translated to English language, and then he came to Carnegie Hall and performed with Frank Sinatra. So those pieces became extremely famous. And Bossa Nova was the first Brazilian style to really take all the jazz tradition, all the jazz harmonies, the music that was being played at the time, by big artists like Chet Baker, for example, and bring those type of chords to Brazil. That's also the time of the war. So the world was going through a lot of economic financial crisis. And the moment that you have financial crisis, there's no more money to sponsor large big bands or large orchestras. So people started to play in small groups, in small bars. All the casinos in Brazil were closed. So it changed the way that people were approaching the instruments. Also, suddenly you had a lot of recording technology and new microphones that were very sensitive. So instead of having a singer singing with vibrato in an orchestra, you could have someone like whispering a melody like, olha que coisa mais linda. So that's kind of the style of João Gilberto, I put on my document João Gilberto and Tom Jobim as the biggest, names in the Bossa Nova movement. And sometimes we think that Bossa Nova is this like long-lasting musical revolution. Actually, Bossa Nova lasted 2 or 3 years. Of course, Bossa Nova created some innovations such as the guitar groove or such as the way of singing that continue to exist in Brazil until nowadays. However, Bossa Nova as a musical movement was extremely short, because right after Bossa Nova started in 1959, and you had all these like rich middle class composers who were like listening to American jazz, drinking their Jack Daniels, smoking a cigar, and playing on their balcony in a nice apartment building in front of the Copacabana beach, Right, a little bit after that, you start to have political tension emerging. And one of the biggest criticisms to Bossa Nova is that, like, how dare you talk about a beautiful Ipanema girl? How dare you talk about the beach and the ocean while people are just starving on the streets, while there's so much inequality going on, when behind your fancy building in Copacabana, there's a favela with 1 million people starving, it doesn't make sense. So this is the type of questioning that started to be made right after Bossa Nova started. And then Brazil went through a huge transformation in 1964. There was a military coup taking over the government, closing the Congress, closing the Senate, closing everything, and in implementing a dictatorial regime in Brazil, which lasted for 20 years and was one of the bloodiest periods of time in the history of the country. And then immediately when you have repression, when you have an authoritarian government, you start to have artists trying to defy that rule, artists trying to create, to express their discontentment through music. So you start to have artists that were, instead of talking about the beach, instead of talking about the butt of the women they would see on the beach, they were now talking about what it meant to be free, or what it meant to actually be Brazilian and honor your local national music instead of trying to take all these American types of harmonies. So this is when this anti-American feeling started to become really, really powerful. And that's the time that I describe on my paper as the university period. By university, I mean a lot of students or people who are connected to the academic world started to rethink what it meant to be Brazilian. Not through the lenses of American jazz, not with fancy guitar chords playing The Girl from Ipanema, but this time playing Brazilian instruments with Brazilian harmonies, with Brazilian melodies. So they start to research more about the folkloric and the folk music of Brazil. And at the same time, also thinking like, well, we don't need to isolate ourselves. We can have our folk music also be mixed with rock or mixed with pop music and reggae and other styles from all over the world. So it's a moment of searching deep down for your roots and at the same time reaching up for other types of styles. And this is how I would describe MPB, Música Popular Brasileira, popular music of Brazil. That's a genre of music. And this is a little hard to describe because there's so many artists that fall into this category of, popular Brazilian music. But basically they're all songwriters that were extremely inventive with the world, with extremely beautiful poetry. And they were constantly creating songs that either challenged the government or talked about, freedom, talked about, equality, or at the same time, they were talking about more psychedelic things. The psychedelic area is normally what we call the Tropicalia, where artists decided to go kind of on the hippie movement, influenced by Woodstock and things like that. And you have artists like Caetano Veloso, Gilberto Gil, who are, essential and everybody should know them. On the side of the protest, more of the political protest, you have artists such as Chico Buarque and also Caetano Veloso in parts. You have Geraldo Vandré, you have Edu Lobo, many names that are there on my list. And then there's a part in the middle that's not one nor the other, that's kind of in the middle, that's more of the Latin American, and I would describe Milton Nascimento as one of those. Instead of connecting only to the Brazilian roots, he decided to connect to the Latin American roots and to a lot of other movements that were happening all over Latin America during times of dictatorship. The dictatorship didn't happen only in Brazil. It happened in Chile, it happened in Argentina, and those countries had amazing cultural production during those years where musicians would research their folklore. So you had a lot of collaborations between Brazilian musicians and Argentinian musicians, and also a lot of music that was being produced in Cuba after the revolution. So there's a way of seeing this from a broader scene, like in this larger perspective. So again, so I mentioned also Djavan and other important composers that we should all know. And that's the music that normally we hear nowadays, is music from this period of MPB, starting from, around 1964. And I did put a lot of albums that I think are amazing on this list. And I would say that, all the names that I've mentioned are, you must know. Those are kind of like, if you know those names that I've mentioned, it means that you have kind of a broad understanding of the evolution of Brazilian music. And nowadays, we have a mix of everything because music is so globalized. You have a lot of instrumental Brazilian music. For example, the music of Hermeto Pascoal, whom I was talking about last week. And if you want to watch the lecture from last week, you can go to my website and it's there. The whole thing is saved. That's kind of the avant-garde Brazilian instrumental music, mixing folk music with free improvisation. You also have a lot of pop music that started to be creative, a lot of pop genres that were kind of created by the cultural industry, like commercial samba. You had a lot, in Brazil is still in constant innovation. And you have genres, and now, for example, the reaction that we have towards, there's a genre called funk carioca, the carioca funk, okay? With extremely obscene lyrics, talking about, extremely obscene dances, and many people, and still we can see the rejection of the elites to this type of music, If you ask a well-educated person, what's your opinion about the carioca funk? It's like, it's terrible, it's horrible, it's like this commercial shitty music. Well, this exact reaction that many of us may feel towards that music is the same reaction that the elite in Brazil has been having for the popular music for the past 150 years. So it's a constant class struggle where the people create a genre, the elite rejects, and eventually the music wins over and everybody accepts it and transforms into a national symbol. So there's a lot of this problem. And this is not only in Brazil, this is all over Latin America. So you can use the same framework to analyze music from all these, from many other places. And many of you, so carioca is the name you give to a person who is born in Rio de Janeiro. Okay, so if you're born in Rio, you're Carioca. The same way if you're born in New York, you're a New Yorker. Okay, and so check out, if I can put a name of some funk artists, like contemporary music that's created now. Funk Carioca is incredible. It's a mix of an African influenced dance called maculele, mixed with a Miami beat kind of pop music, mixed with hip hop, because the melodies, the lyrics don't have melodies. It's like kind of like spoken voice. So I think it's fascinating, and I can write something like here. I'm putting here are some names, just if you want to check out. These are some old, they're modern funks that are way different, and I'll think about more and send some videos. And it's interesting to see how in the beginning you may react with some rejection, but then eventually it will become part of our national symbol. So that's the idea about Brazil. The next time you think about Brazilian music, think about plurality, think about class struggle, think about like constant fight of one rejecting the music of the other, and at the same time incorporating that music. It's a crazy thing, you know, where like something that's rejected suddenly starts to become the national norm. And at the same time, remember that the music in Brazil has influences from all directions, especially from Africa. So we shouldn't underestimate the importance of that, and how much that's part of our culture, and how much we owe to that inheritance. And so on my Google Docs, you have a full playlist, and you will have some of these names if you want to, you know, listen more. I recommend that you all listen to that. And even if you're Brazilian, you know, sometimes we don't know certain artists very well. So I do this every day. I open YouTube and I type the name of an artist that I should check out, but I've never checked out. You know, I should know more about this person, but I don't. So every day I start my day by listening to an album by someone that I don't really know that well, or that I should know. And yeah, let me see if I already, yeah, here's the Google Docs, everybody. So that's it. Studying music, studying a specific music is an open door to study the lives of the people who created that music. So I hope that by giving this short, brief explanation, at least I can give you a hint of what it means to be part of the Brazilian people, looking from inside, not looking from the outside. So check out this music and see if you can understand more of this dynamic interaction and all of these complexities. So thank you all. I'm now here to answer questions. So if you want to talk and ask questions, I'm here for another, I don't know. I have nowhere to go, to be honest. So, but if you need to leave, feel free to leave, and feel free to email me if you have questions, or if you wanna, if you know something that I don't know, or if you disagree with what I said, you know, I would love to talk to you. So if you have questions, there are a lot of people here. So I don't know if you can raise your hand or make a sound, and I'll try to find you here on the pages and pages of people. Okay?
Henrique, there are also questions in the chat if you want to look at them.
Okay, so Ranan is asking me here, can you name artists that created music in the time of oppression? What did you mean here? I don't know what you mean with oppression. Probably during the dictatorship is what you mean. Can you say yes if that's what you mean? Yeah. So I would recommend Chico Buarque as the main one. You know, Chico Buarque. He's on the page. I would also say someone like Geraldo Vandré is a very famous one I'm writing here. Geraldo Vandré. Oops, sorry. Geraldo Vandré. They were very famous for creating protest songs. And many of those artists, they had pieces that were about protest and others that were about other things. So it's not only protest, but if you check that list, most of the artists that I've mentioned were involved with resistance, I would call. Okay, let me see if I have any other questions here. Joe is saying, when did the Rio Carnival become so mega massive and commercial? Does the music in it still matter? So it depends. In Rio, during the 30s, we had a president called Getúlio Vargas, who was a really powerful populist government, who also actually started a dictatorship for 7 years. And he was responsible for transforming suddenly Carnival and Samba into national symbols. So that's the time when they started to have the big parades, and there was government instruction for composers to write lyrics that were talking about the beauties of Brazil. So all the lyrics, in order to be able to participate in the Carnival parades, all the lyrics had to do with see how Brazilian people work hard. The workers are so powerful. You know, our nature is so beautiful. So everything is about, you know, nationalism. So that's when this whole Carnival megalomania started. And of course, with time, they started to understand the touristic profitability of Carnival. And then it was an amazing way of making money, having like thousands and thousands of people coming and you know, paying money to watch the parades and sell, you know, merchandise, sells records and everything. So, and it became one of the only possibilities of people who were poor to suddenly be on the spotlight. So Carnival is still extremely important, as perhaps almost an illusory, like a small split second where a community from a favela can suddenly be on the most important avenue playing their music and showing their culture. So there is this other side. We can see with some criticism or not, you know, but it's very powerful. And let's see. Francisco is asking, I'm interested in the introduction of contemporary compositional devices of the 20th century. You mean in classical music or in more of the popular music? And because I would say, if you want to check out kind of the classical composers, you should start checking them out from the 1920s on, because before, every classical composer in Brazil was imitating European music. The famous Brazilian classical composer from the 1860s, Carlos Gomes, was writing operas in Italian.
Oh.
So, you know, it's in Italian, 100% Italian. You should start checking out the classical composers, starting from the Villa-Lobos tradition. So I would say Villa-Lobos. There's another one called Camargo Guarnieri. Camargo.
Yeah, I remember you mentioned one time in class about Antonio Carlos Jobim writing with influences on the Cubism or Serialism, let's say.
Absolutely. So Jobim's teacher was an Austrian 12-tone contemporary composer called Kohlreuter, who was a super contemporary intellectual European guy that was running away from the war and came to Brazil and was teaching Jobim. So Jobim had in his mind a lot of that, you know, contemporary music influence, and Jobim copies Villa-Lobos all the time. And not, you know, the nationalism that happened in Brazil also happened in many other parts of the world. All over, you have, you know, in Argentina, you have Alberto Ginastera, you know, you have Moncayo, you have all sorts of other composers, you know, in all over Latin America, trying to find their national style. So it's yeah, but the ones, you know, I would say, Villa-Lobos is amazing. It's pretty fantastic. If you check out all his pieces, you can find a lot of incredible things. And Camargo Guarnieri and Guerra Peixe are two other very important classical composers. So, yeah. Let's see. I'm seeing here. What is Tropicalia? Nice. That's a good question. Tropicalia is part of the musical movement from the late 60s that is the equivalent of kind of the Woodstock in Brazil, where it's a mix of Brazilian folk music with rock, with guitar, and with electronic things, and it's kind of very, very crazy. And and the main album from this time, I don't think it's on Spotify, but you can search on YouTube. It's called Panis et Circenses Tropicalia. Sorry, I'm sending to everybody here. Everyone in meeting. This album is amazing, and you're gonna see that it has guitars, and then suddenly you have like African percussion, and then you have something suddenly something lyrical. So Tropicalia is really fun. It's a great type of music, and I strongly recommend you to check out. But it was more of like a group of artists. Also, there's another band that's called Novos Baianos. If you're into Tropicalia, you can check out this band, Novos Baianos, who basically is a collective of composers and performers in Bahia, in the north of Brazil, who are writing music that also had a lot of guitar and at the same time mandolin. Like, so it's this mix of electronic, of future and past together, and all with a lot of influence of the hippie movement. And this is music that was reprehended by the government. The government didn't really enjoy some of this musical manifestations. There was a lot of censorship going on, so it was very hard for artists to publish their pieces, especially when it was talking anything about, you know, governmental things or politics. All right, so Tropicalia was a musical movement then. Yes, correct, it was a musical movement, but it wasn't as huge, you know, it wasn't like a national thing where everybody suddenly was listening. It was a group of people, you know, that decided to think about Brazil from the root perspective and at the same time from the futuristic perspective of like globalization. There's something really cool that happened. I think, I don't remember the year, but there was a march in Brazil, a protest of Brazilian musicians against electric guitar. This was a big thing that happened at 60 something. I don't remember the year, but there was an actual protest, and that started with Gilberto Gil, Elis Regina, against electric guitar. They were like, no, we don't want any American influence in our music. We want a pure Brazilian music. And eventually they realized that, like, no, it's stupid. We should incorporate guitar. And that's part of the Tropicalia movement ideals. The idea that you can, you know, it's okay to have instruments from other places. So yes, it is a musical movement. Any other questions? Oh, here, I see Alina. Does Jobim or Bossa Nova music is counted as a big heritage for Brazilians, or it's more by foreigners by bigger promotion? Well, I think it is a big heritage for Brazilians too. One of the reasons, because it became so famous outside, that then it also became as famous inside, you know? So a lot of Brazilians are very proud of the fact that Bossa Nova is, you know, our music. But I would say, you know, on the hierarchy of amazing Brazilian music, I would put in the middle of the list. I would put Samba much higher. I would put Choro much higher. You know, I think those styles are much more interesting. It's just that Bossa Nova had lyrics in English, and in 1964, João Gilberto and Astrid Gilberto won the Grammy. And in second place, the Beatles. So basically, you know, that's how big Bossa Nova was in the world. You know, João Gilberto won a Grammy over the Beatles. And of course, Beatles weren't yet at their peak, but this is 1964. And yeah, Francisco is saying same happens in other musics of Caribbean or South America. Correct. Yeah. And yeah, I wish I knew much more about that to be able to give a more general panorama of the situation. Here, Omri is asking, what mode, scale, harmony structures are common in the native instrumental music? Well, I don't think there is such a thing as native instrumental music, because for natives, the music was always vocal and connected to ritual. So in terms of modes and scales, it's a lot of vocal music with percussion, you know, or sometimes the flute. And whenever you study something that is really, really native and folk, normally the melodies are always pentatonic. You know, it's the same in all over the world, you know. So one thing that you can see in the northeast of Brazil, sometimes you have modes. Sometimes you can have like Mixolydian mode, or you can have like Dorian mode, but that's way more of an influence of Europe, of Renaissance music from Europe, or is an inheritance from a little bit of the Arabic taste that was in Portuguese people when they first came to Brazil. But now the natives, they were always doing either percussion and singing and one note or pentatonic. Very, very, very simple. Okay. Joe's asking, could you talk a little bit about batucada? Batucada is one of the terms that we use to describe music that is played by a lot of percussion instruments. So it's not really a style, or whenever you have what we call a samba school, and you can call that batucada. It's just a bunch of percussion players together. So I would say that batucada is a general term that especially police would call whenever they saw a bunch of enslaved people playing percussion. That's the difference between the US and Brazil, by the way. In the US, drumming was forbidden. So none of the enslaved people in the US could drum. So all of their musical background was basically lost, or they had to like develop new forms of expressing their culture. In Brazil, they were allowed to drum. The government tried to forbid drumming, but imagine you forbid drumming and there are like 6 million enslaved people angry at you. There could be a major revolution. And they were afraid of what was going on in Haiti, because in Haiti there was a big revolution, and basically the enslaved people in Haiti killed all the white people in the island and started a republic, a black republic. The first black republic in the world is Haiti. So in Brazil, the government was like, no. We better let everybody drum. We better let them do their own rituals and their music. Let's not forbid. Let's even let them pray for their gods. We can tell them to pray for Jesus and also pray for Iemanjá and also pray for Ogum, Oshun, all the African gods and also all the Christian gods. It doesn't matter as long as they are okay and there's not a major protest. Because if there was a rebellion, it could mean the end of the Portuguese colonization in Brazil. So anyways, batucada was how they would describe whenever like people were just playing a lot of drumming together. So now you can see the result of batucada whenever you see a carnival parade and you see like 2,000 percussion players playing at the same time. That's kind of the ultimate expression of, batucada. That's kind of like the climax of it. Okay. Any other question? Let me see. If I missed the question, you can ask me again or unmute your microphone and ask me in person, okay? Here, João Carlos asking me, other than funk, is there a musical movement to which you would give a name for the 1990s to the present period? Well, I would say that a lot of the Brazilian instrumental music comes from this time, where you have names like Hamilton de Holanda, the mandolin player Hermeto Pascoal, Egberto Gismonti, who are big names in like instrumental music. On the same side, you can talk. There's a lot of country Brazilian music that I personally hate, but it's very popular. Yeah. So there's a lot of pagode. Pagode. I'm writing here if you want to check it out, which is kind of like a more of a pop. A lyrical, cute pop version of samba, where you have keyboards and you have like harmonies that are a little more sweet, and melodies that are more connected to like the commercial pop industry. But you can still see a lot of good pagode bands, and always go on YouTube and check out. At some point, you're gonna find something good, but. Basically, everything that becomes too commercial, I personally tend to have a little bit of a reaction, because I think it's not so honest. And honesty in music for me is very, very important when I'm analyzing a certain type of music. If it's not honest, if I see that the commercial intent is bigger than the artistic intent, I tend to dislike. This for any type of music, not only in Brazil, by the way, okay? What comes to mind when you think about the future of Brazilian music? Well, I think we need to understand that the best types of music in the world are the ones who accept constant transformation, constant metamorphosis. Any style that gets too solidified and frozen loses power. So it becomes kind of a museum.